All right. Hello and welcome to our panel, The American Revolution and the Left, sponsored by the Platypus Affiliated Society. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left, for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. Please talk to one of our members if you would like to get involved with the local chapter here at UNH. I am Noah. I'm the discussion leader for our group. Zach is the president. Abby is the treasurer. You can talk to any one of us if you have any sort of questions about our organization. We meet Thursdays from 6 to 8 in the Diamond Library for reading groups, and you can come to those, and we're also going to be hosting those on Zoom over the summer since the semester is ending very soon, and once again when the academic year starts up again in the fall. We also want to give a big thanks to the UNH Socratic Society, the primary coordinator Kaylee, and co-coordinator Andre for helping us to organize this event. And if you have any questions about the UNH Socratic Society, you can talk to Kaylee. All right. Our three panelists are Matthew Dowd, or perhaps I should give you all an order of how you're seated. Aaron Smith-Walter is an assistant professor of political science, the interim director of Master of Public Administration at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, the current president of Massachusetts chapter of American Society for American Public Administration, and associate editor for Policy Studies Journal. He has published articles in peer-reviewed journals such as Public Personnel Management, Politics and Policy, International Review of Public Administration, Quality and Quantity, Policy Studies Journal, Public Integrity, Municipal Finance Journal, Applied Economic Letters, the International Review of Public Policy, and the International Journal of Organizational Theory and Behavior. His research interests revolve primarily around the Narrative Policy Framework, NPF, the cultural theory, and images of public administration in popular fiction. He's been a member of the Socialist Party of the United States since 2009 and is currently the Secretary for Outreach for the Socialist Party of Southern New Hampshire. Matthew Dowd is Senior Lecturer in the UNH Philosophy Department, PhD in Philosophy, Master of Arts, Comparative Religious Experience. Matt's concentration is in continental philosophy, especially phenomenology of post-war Europe. His interest in politics in general, and Marx specifically, stem from a concern about the relationship between work, self-fulfillment, humanity, and freedom. Venia Stallcup is secretary of the Southern NH chapter of the Communist Party USA. They take political inspiration from podcasts such as Radio War Nerd, Revolutions, and Hell of Presidents. So, the prompt for today's panel. The American Revolution and its significance has been a recurring topic of discussion over the last decade. The 1619 Project by the New York Times places the founding moment of America when the first slave came to America's shore, while historians such as Gordon Wood maintain 1776 as the founding date. But beyond the cultural rhetoric, how should the left understand the American Revolution? Is it part of the world historical advance of freedom, a local revolt of slaveholders, or something else? What was the legacy of the American Revolution? Did the Founding Fathers represent the left of their epoch? What lessons from the American Revolution can be salvaged for the left, if any? So each panelist will have 10 minutes to give their opening remarks, and after that, they will have 5 minutes to give responses to the comments that they've each made. And after that, we will open it up to all of you for a Q&A section. So without any further ado, if Aaron would like to begin.
Sure. Fantastic. Thank you, Noah. I wanted to thanks everybody for the invitation. It's great to be here today. And I just want to sort of preface by saying that the prompt, as it's written, is pretty sweeping. So it's a big topic, and I am not going to be able to cover it, so I'm not going to try. I'm going to focus on two particular questions that are embedded within the prompt. The first of those, should we consider the Founding Fathers as representative of the left of their epoch? Epoch? How do we say that? I'm not sure, right? And second, what lessons from the American Revolution can be salvaged, if any? Okay, so first, I just want to ask a couple questions. How many people feel that the redistribution of wealth is generally a policy of the left? Raise your hand. Okay. How many people feel that the printing of paper money is generally a policy position supported by the left? That's kind of a weird one, isn't it, right? How about, who here thinks debt forgiveness is generally a policy of the left? Okay, so I'll put all my cards on the table. I think that all of these are policies of the left, and it's important for us to appreciate that in any modern context, a leftist movement which doesn't champion at least some of these policies is a leftist movement, question mark, right? So that's my position, that we should defend these as leftist positions. And so when we think about these as leftist positions, should we then interpret the Founding Fathers as being on the left? I answer not really. The Founding Fathers, I think, can be best conceived as a progressive but decidedly Republican political movement, which was revolutionary in the sense that it opposed aristocracy and monarchy, right, which was basically undergirded by an imperial political formulation, right, resting on a hereditary monarchy, right, but the notion of a democratic form of government, right, as a leftist movement might suppose, was not appealing to the majority of founders, and the movement toward a stronger and more centralized federal government, which manifested itself in the discussions in the Constitutional Convention of 1787, came with explicit treatments of how to design our constitutional system so as to protect the property of the wealthy from popular demands for specific economic policies that would serve the interests of the majority. Right, so too long didn't read. No, they're not, because they don't support, right, policies that would benefit the majority of the people in any real sense. And I believe this because we can reject the idea that they were of the left, because we can read what they wrote, right? So if we turn to the Federalist Papers, right, which our corrupt Supreme Court, as you know, does from time to justify their particular decisions, we can read the writings of James Madison, the father of the Constitution, writing under the nom de plume of Publius, right, which he shared mostly with Alexander Hamilton, right, with an underscore note by John Jay. He got sick a lot, right, so he didn't do a whole ton of writing. But he said basically this when discussing the virtues of a Republican form of government as opposed to a democratic one. He says that the influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread to a general conflagration through the other states. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against the danger from that source. And here's the part I want to underscore. A rage for paper money, for the abolition of debt, for an equal division of property, or for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it, in the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than an entire state. Right, pretty explicit, right? Madison says, hey, these projects, they're wicked. We don't like them, right? Keep them out. So we can then appreciate that he was conscious, right, and responding to a more radical set of demands which existed in the political discussions of the time, right? So he explicitly rejected what I would posit are leftist positions on these particular policies. Going further, he also understands and addresses the distinction between a Republican form of government, which he champions, and one which is democratic, right, which he rejects. And he says that complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of the public and private faith and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that the measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority, right? So he is saying here, hey, we don't want to have democratic control over our particular aspects of government, and we will rely instead on the construct of the new federal government to keep the majority in check. So what Madison wants us to understand is that, one, using the constitutional structure must be able to defend the interest of the minority from the will of the majority. And while this may have particular benefits for individuals, it also explicitly shields the propertied elite from potential redistribution, which any leftist movement worth its salt has to champion. This becomes even more clear, right, in Madison's passage in the Federalist 10, where, when he's dealing with how constitutional design, as envisioned in the U.S. Constitution, will deal with these various factions, he tells us who we should consider as different factions, who have separate interests. And he says that in the diversity of the faculties of men from which the rights of property originate, it is not less an insuperable obstacle to a uniformity of interest. The protection of these faculties is, and I want to underline here, the first object of government. The first object of government is to protect the differential acquisition and protection of property. From the protection of different and unequal faculties in acquiring property, the possession of different degrees and kinds of property immediately results. From the influence of these on the sentiments and views of the respective proprietors ensues a division of society into different interests and parties. And he goes on to name these, right? To quote, "The most common and durable source of faction has been the various and unequal distribution of property. And those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination, a landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, and many lesser interests grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different classes, actuated by different sentiments and views." And here is another key passage. "The regulation of these various and interfering interests form the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operation of government." So what do we understand then from all of these passages, right, written by Madison, right, intended to support the adoption of the Constitution? One, the constitutional order, right, which the Revolution was carried out to establish, right, or eventually ended up establishing, should I say, safeguards the ability of individuals to accumulate property. It legally recognizes distinct types of property. It protects the property of the individual against the claims of the majority, and it impedes particular popular policy demands that might arise to redress inequality, explicitly in the arguments put forward for adopting the Constitution. Right? And it should be noted, of course, at this time that Madison is writing, property rights included the rights to own other individuals, right? Slave owners were, in fact, being recognized as an interest that would be defended, right? The practice of coverture, whereby married women ceded their property, right, rights to men, were also protected explicitly by the argument that Madison is making here. So we need to understand, not only are we talking about policies that are focused on wealth redistribution, the printing of paper money, but also ownership in other human beings and ownership of other human beings' property. So that's my basic reading of the argument that the Federalists are making and the argument that carries the day in the establishment of the U.S. federal Constitution. But we can also look at some of the actions that were taken, right? It's one thing to say something, it's another thing to do it, right? Anybody who gets to clean out a garage knows that. I'm always going to clean it out next Saturday, right? So we can look then at one of the other members of the nom de plume triad, Alexander Hamilton, who took the position, right, of the Secretary of the Treasury for the United States under the new Constitution. And one of the first things that he did was put together a bill called the Funding Act of 1790, right? It's a barn burner of a piece of legislation in case anybody's interested in falling asleep very quickly. This is one of the great ones. And what it did is it required the federal government of the United States to assume all of the debts of the various states, right? Because to finance the Revolutionary War, states took out a lot of debt, and the federal government under Hamilton was like, give it all to me, right? Now, why would Hamilton do this, right? Normally, I spend most of my time trying to figure out how to get rid of my debt. Hamilton takes the other approach, and he does this as a tool to harness and tame the factions that Madison was writing about in Federalist 10, right? So the new debt, the debt that was assumed, was financed by the issuing of federal bonds, right? And these bonds basically said, hey, if you are owed debt under the states, under the Continental Congress, we will repay that debt. Now, like any government action or government program, it took them a lot of time to do this. So who did they pay the debt back to? Certainly the Dutch, right? The French, right? But also individual Americans, ex-soldiers, ex-farmers who were given IOUs, right, by the Continental Army, right? Years go by, no action. So if you were a poor farmer, right, struggling to get by, an ex-soldier, what do? Well, we do exactly what we do currently still in America. We sell our interest to speculators. So speculators bought this debt. Congress comes in, assumes all the debt of the states, and says, hey, we're going to pay this back, right? Immediately cementing the interest of the moneyed classes, the mercantile classes, the property classes, the slave-owning classes who had the capital to invest in these speculative investments, and they now become wedded to the success of the United States because they're getting paid dividends every year. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, of course, not if you're the soldiers, right, who sold their interest, who sold their IOUs, and especially not because how do you pay for this? Well, Hamilton had a great idea. What do Americans love to do, right? At the time, and maybe currently we are on a college campus, they love to drink, right? So he establishes an excise tax on locally produced liquors and an import tax on foreign importation, right? And this gives rise to what's referred to in the history books as the Whiskey Rebellion. I draw heavily on the work of William Hoagland here. If you ever get a chance to pick up any of his books, right, I do recommend them. And so basically Hamilton decides what we're going to do is we're going to pay back all of these speculators and the wealthy by imposing a tax on individuals, right, based on their production of liquor and their consumption of liquor, right? And so this is all well and good for people who basically produce liquor as a vocation, but it has a particular and pernicious impact on members of the society who live on the frontier, especially farmers.
Yeah, I hate to do this, but it's been a little bit over 10 minutes, so if you're able to finish up quickly here.
Absolutely, if I could have like 30 seconds. So basically what ends up happening is these farmers ferment their grains to prevent spoilage. They use that whiskey as currency, right? And also as a means of saving the value of their labor. The tax then imposes a doubly onerous position on them as they're taxing their local currency, they're taxing their labor, rebellion breaks out, the new powers of the federal government are mobilized, the militia marches in, right? And we begin to see the taxing and the threat imposed on average everyday Americans by the federal government to enrich the wealthy. So what do we learn from this? And here is where I'll close up. I'm sorry for going over. We've seen the Federalists and the founders of the nation spend an inordinate amount of time and energy, right, to construct state power in a particular way that advantages the wealthy. What can the left learn from this? It is absolutely essential then that we contest that state power, right, and contest it through a independent third-party movement in the electoral sphere. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, our next speaker, Professor Matthew Dowd.
All right, so, I was thinking about what the founders are and that sort of thing, and I always do this. I go right into work, right, and I forget to do all my business ahead of time. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks for inviting me and having me here. It's really nice, and I enjoy this sort of thing. So it's nice to be invited. Now back to business. So what are the founders? And I'm thinking about how I was brought up, and I guess I had the patriotic family, not overly so. We did go to D.C. and we lived in Philadelphia, so the Liberty Bell and all the other stuff. I mean, it was really, it was there, and it was part of our lives. And then I spent some time in the South. I used to swim under the Stone Mountain Monument, and had another sense of it from there. Slavery was then like a thing, that was happened, but not the thing that we were talking about. and when we would take our field trips to the old Confederate places, and then I remember like when I learned that the founders had slaves. I was like, I felt betrayed. I mean, I guess I should have figured it out, but it was like, I thought, because they were so immaculate, such great men, and I guess I mean men here, so the gender specificity. But that they had slaves, and then that thing that I'd heard about, I'd actually learned that it's in the Constitution. They wrote the laws. 3/5. Is that right? 3/5.
Yep.
These great men. It's not an accident. It was an institution. I mean, and then after that, the Native American treatment of Native Americans, or alongside of that, and just the whole attitude of appropriation. And I'm like, oh, these founders who are so awesome, a moment ago in my development are now problematized. And so what do I think? There's that conservative moment in me. I want to deny the facts. No, they are great men, damn it, la 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 la. Perfect in every way. Like Mary Poppins, right? But it can't stand that way. I have it, but it can't stand. I have to, deal with it. So, can we think about the founders and maybe praise them in spite of slavery? I mean, they owned people and founded a democracy. And in the founding, inscribed the ownership of people. So, can I separate them? Is it like praising Nazis for something? Just like bad taste, or maybe just horrific? And, I think, can I separate them in history? I guess no. I mean, it's a fact. So there's that. But I can separate them ideally or conceptually, and we do. At least I hope we do. And here, at the very least, I want to do something like I call it my checkers move. Right? I want to at least consider these men as if they are great men in spite of slavery. What do they have? What do they bring to the table? And not take my finger off of it, but always slide it back. So whatever great things may show themselves are put back into that context. And whatever the case is, I don't think I'm the final word here of the assessment of the meaning of slavery or anything. So I'm just sort of like floating some ideas here, and especially about the nature of the founders. They're already idealized and ideal. I mean, we talk about them as ours. The founding fathers, our founding fathers, so they're not, it's not people, it's not like the individuals. We're not thinking of them individually. We're thinking of them as the we that gave us what we have. In this sense, I think that we're asking only about one part of what the founders are about. We're asking about what the founders have handed down, right? So we're asking about what the founders have founded. And we ask, have they given us institutions from back in the day that solve our problems now? That's a way to look at it. But we also need to understand that, there's the founding and the founded. We live under what they have founded. They were in the action of founding. They were in the moment of creating the law under which they were going to live, and we live under that law. If we want to compare ourselves to the founders, we don't want to compare ourselves just to what they founded. We want to be founders. The best way to honor the founders is not by merely following them. So what does that mean? What they founded, this was the reason of the revolution. They wanted to give themselves a stable government, a thing that was established. But the Constitution, the establishment of that law, is by itself conservative because it is to conserve, to make stable for ourselves and posterity. And like Thomas Jefferson said, I'm afraid we might be setting people up to be ruled by dead men. So I decided this. How do I want to be a founder? I want Americans in 200 years to talk about how horrific my era is. I want them to, will they call us the age of waste and greed? The era of ownership and violence? I want to be called these names because it would be some sort of promise that they have moved beyond us and look back and see how we have fallen short. That's not going to happen by some magic moment in the future where humans finally see humans as humans in some magical reflective moment. The future that will judge us to be wanting is ours to make. We will hand down to posterity a future. Will it think us great or despise us? If it's great, then it's not changed. If it despises us, it has grown beyond us. The one institution that I think that is the most dangerous and most vulnerable to allowing this founding to happen is education. I think that the horrors of ever thinking that those great men owned people means that maybe they're fallible and we can change things. If we never get to question, we think that they are infallible, so why would we ever change? So if ever there is an institution, a revolutionary institution that needs to be guarded more than anything, it's education. And whether the founders saw that or thought that or wanted that doesn't matter anymore. It's ours. And that's all I've got to say.
All right, and our final speaker, Venia Stallcup.
All right. So I, like Aaron, I took the prompt kind of broadly, and I decided to focus in on a couple of different ideas, namely how we as the left, term I don't really like, should view, interact with, and understand the legacy of the American Revolution and the founders. And I started off with something kind of trite by answering questions with questions. So, what is the significance and the true nature of the American Revolution? Does it really constitute a revolution in the socialist perspective? Was there a break with the established regimes of exploitation and domination, or an entrenchment of them? We can see the answers to these questions plainly in my estimation. By the very purposeful and conscious design of the Founding Fathers, the U.S. government, the state more broadly, has always been designed to maintain regimes of exploitation and oppression by both private and state actors. So-called liberty-loving minds like Jefferson and Hamilton, despite their personal enmity, found common ground in the notion that the common run of American white men, completely excluding all women and non-white people, or, quote, the great beast, as Hamilton called them, should at all costs be kept from the levers of power, and that the right to political and economic self-determination must be kept in as tight a circle as possible. As socialists, we recognize revolutions as a break with the current regime of domination and exploitation, and nowhere in the 13 colonies were those regimes broken with. In fact, in many places, such as the South and West, these systems of exploitation and expropriation were largely entrenched. The driving factor of Southern states' agreement to join the War of Independence were foremost an incessant need to expand. The only way to continue the growth and viability of the slave economy was the further expropriation and settlement of indigenous lands for the purpose of establishing new plantations, as the cash crop development in the early planter states had already largely depleted the soil of its richness and fertility. Westward expansion was the key to the continuation of slavery, and at the time of the War of Independence, further westward expansion by British colonists was forbidden after the end of the 7 Years' War. The British Empire said, you can't go west any further. We have treaties with the French, we have treaties with the indigenous people. We can't afford another war. That directly conflicts with the interest of the slaveocracy of the South. After the 13 colonies achieved independence, those restrictions were lifted, and settlers moved west, killing, expropriating, and enslaving as they went. This is not the work of a revolutionary state, as any socialist should recognize it. While over time the American state has been forced to open up its democratic process to avoid heightening internal contradictions to a breaking point, never in that history have we seen a real break with the systems of exploitation and domination built into the foundation of our state and society. With the sole exception of the emancipation of slaves during what is far closer to a true American Revolution, the Civil War and military Reconstruction, that's it insofar as we see a truly revolutionary moment in American history is the emancipation of slaves and what you could almost call a people's army in the Union. But even that great leap forward was stifled and eventually halted altogether. The slaveocracy returned in a new form of tenant farming and sharecropping. The amendments to our Constitution outlawing slavery even include a backdoor by which people of any race can now be enslaved in our carceral system. With all this, how should we as socialists see and understand the American War for Independence? Is there anything at all worth upholding from this founding generation? Most assuredly. While many at the time cynically deployed the rhetoric of freedom, liberty, and democracy, there are a few, most notably Thomas Paine, who truly believed in these words and ideas. Of all the founding generation, it is Thomas Paine who most genuinely expressed what could be called a left-wing ideology. And he was not in the room when the Constitution was written. He was not in the room when the Declaration of Independence was written. He was not in government. While many noble and valorous virtues are expressed in the Constitution, it all rings incredibly hollow when one examines the conditions it fostered. insofar as any of the framers and signatures of the Constitution were concerned, the freedom and liberties they were enshrining were the only ones that mattered. Their own freedom to own, their own freedom to exploit, their own freedom to expropriate. In their minds, property was liberty, and the acquisition of it was what made one worthy of a say in governance. These notions of property equals freedom persist to this day. It is a staple of both major American political parties' ideologies. The legacy of these founding notions of elite dominance of the political world is still felt to this day. Even with the expansion of the franchise to non-whites and all women, we remained an incredibly undemocratic society. As each expansion of the franchise was accompanied by a shift more towards non-democratic administrative control, to the point that today voting in national elections is about as meaningful as picking Yankees over Red Sox. Totally divorced from the actual levers of power. With each new abstraction of authority of the state to unelected government and private bodies, we have only seen a decrease in any actual input of the democratic process on our day-to-day lives. Regardless of who sits in the Oval Office, the general staff of the Pentagon, federal agencies, and most of the courts stay the same and pursue the same goals. How should we conceptualize the War of Independence? Was it an advance of freedom and liberty? Was it representative of the great mass of people rising to break the old order and establish a new one? No. It was a baronial revolt, a civil war among the colonial ruling classes for domination and supremacy on the continent. It is not a revolution as socialists understand the term, a rebellion of colonial elites who were tired of being constrained and wedded to the metropole of London. What few lessons we could glean from the American founders, we can glean from myriad other sources not so tainted. That's all I have.
All right, now we're going to have a brief response section in which each panelist will have 5 minutes to respond to some of the other things that the other panelists have said. Should we start with Venya?
I mostly kind of agree with what Aaron has said, and I definitely appreciate Matt's perspective on trying to extrapolate lessons and values from people who we may not necessarily agree with, and whether or not it's decided on all of them, whether or not there are people we can uphold is maybe not necessarily my decision individually. Like I said, I do think there are people like Thomas Paine, and Benjamin Franklin is kind of problematic, but he at least was an avid abolitionist. So even at the time, there were people in the founding generation who knew what they were doing, like saw the problems, and essentially called the shot of, this will stop working if parties develop. And immediately parties developed. And there were people at the time who could see the writing on the wall, so to speak. And, there definitely are notions in the Declaration of Independence that went on to inspire far more revolutionary movements that actually consisted of a breaking of the systems of oppression and power. But I would argue that the American War of Independence cannot in good faith be called a revolution, not even really a bourgeois revolution, because the rule of the slave masters is basic. What's the difference between a slave master and a feudal lord? Practically, there are obviously legal distinctions, but I would argue that we didn't break with any sort of feudal tradition, and it was actually the entrenchment therein by the colonial revolt.
Matthew?
I think I don't know what, historically, I don't, it's not really my thing to say, it's not my field, so it seems pretty obvious that, by standards of socialism, or any Marxist standards, the founders were even anywhere near a revolution. There's not even industrialization, so it's I don't know if it's even proper to talk about it in that way. However, I think it's important to highlight it. It is, of course, always rich people doing things. There's still some things that I think that extend beyond that, and maybe this is just my vague patriotism poking through, when it doesn't seem like they would pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor just on money, so even if it was that, by and large, because you can't argue that it's not, I don't know if that means that that money and property and that kind of power describes the whole of the revolution. And even if it does, who cares? It's ours now. Let us not live under our father.
All right. Aaron.
Sure, yeah, I'd like to, I guess, touch briefly on three sort of different topics. So the first is, again, and you'll forgive me because I am a public administration scholar by training, so I do train bureaucrats as a living, right? So please, grain of salt, right, with everything we're about to say. But we can also take a look, and I encourage you again, if you're having trouble sleeping, for another one of Alexander Hamilton's wonderful reports, which was called the Report on Manufactures, right? And I think that what we have to remember is that, as Venya said, we can't anticipate that what the founders wanted was freedom for all people. They explicitly did not, right? Now, what did they want? They wanted freedom for the people, right? We can think about this as a floating signifier which exists out there. Who are the people? We get to decide, right? And that is one of the places I definitely agree with Matthew, right? We have an existing framework which we've inherited, the Constitution itself, right? We like to lie to ourselves as Americans and say, we've got the oldest Constitution that's still in operation. BS, right? We've amended it a number of times, and the Constitution, in addition to having a mechanism by which we can actually amend it formally, society changes. We change, right? When I was in university, right, you had to fight for gay marriage. It looks like we're going to have to do that again, right? But there has been change. We're moving back the other way, especially in the South. But the meaning of what it meant to be married changed. We changed that, right, through our social interactions. And the most important role for the left historically in the United States is to expand what was meant by the people. Right? That is something that we can engage in, a struggle that we can engage in every single day, right? And people who are interested in justice and liberty, right, should do that. So I think that we have that possibility, because one of the things you might notice about the story that I told is that the founders said, we're not going to forgive debt, right? And they were very explicit that they're not going to do that. They thought it was bad. Guess what they didn't do? They didn't forgive the debt of the United States, right? So there is an existing framework. I think Matthew touched on it, right? We can look at these notions of honor, right? In many senses, these were pre-industrial notions of human relations which existed. And we have a duty to actually appreciate and understand, right? What do we mean to behave honorably now? What do we mean by the people? How do we look on others who do not resemble ourselves or share our experiences, right? And we can decide that they are, in fact, right? I hate to say that this is a radical notion, but maybe it is in our world today, that people are people and they are deserving, right, of the same treatment of grace and respect and rights and guarantees to housing and healthcare and education that every other person under the sun is entitled to. That's our decision, right? We can do that, right? And that is part of what I believe the left should do. And so we have that particular actual opportunity, right? And this gets at Hamilton's manufactures, because Hamilton didn't sit there, right, and say, I'm going to be wedded to this notion of chattel slavery as a driving force. Hamilton fought for the commercial republic, and this is where Hamilton and Madison part ways after the Constitution, right? Madison is Virginia gentry, right? he's very, very out there. He came up to New Jersey for school, right? Then he goes back to the South, right? And then he decides, I'm totally happy, right, with these folks who are all around me, who furnish me with all of my worldly goods, to be deprived of the right to vote, to be 3/5 of a person, to be sold out from under their family if and when I decide, right? He made that decision. It was wrong. We can condemn it, right? We should. I do. So what do we need to do now, right? We need to understand that Hamilton had a different idea, right? And if you want to read Christian Parenti's book, Radical Hamilton, he goes into this, right? Where he talks about, if you think about what Hamilton's doing as a project, right? Hamilton, as opposed to the other founders, comes up, right, as basically an orphan, like back to the old honor culture, someone of ill repute. His mother wasn't married when he was born, right? Anybody who's seen the musical knows this, right? So I'm not giving you anything new here, right? But what happens is he says, look, we can take this public debt and we can turn it into an engine for growth. And what do we do with that engine for growth? Well, we bind it to the rich people. Hamilton was nothing if not a bootlicker, right? That's what he always was, always has been, right? But what did he do? He used that, right, to build a modern, quote unquote, banking system, right, which he advocated we use to industrialize, right, to reject the old colonial bonds with the mother country, right? He loved the idea of being an Englishman, but he definitely didn't want to have all of his tea pass through a third party before he could buy it, right? Because he was a merchant, right? That's where he kind of came from. So the commercial republic, right, established by a founder, right, in ideology, in bills proposed to Congress, right, in the founding documents, is something that we can harness ourselves to engage in the industrialization of our country, the reindustrialization of our country, right? If you want to see what happens when a country deindustrializes, go to the Rust Belt, go to Appalachia, right? These are things that we can see and that we can prevent given the structures, the tools, and the ideas, right, in part, that the founders created. The second thing I'd like to touch on is this idea that Venya talked about, the Civil War as a revolution, right? What do we see with the Civil War as a revolution? And I agree with you that this is a much closer approximation of what I would understand to be a revolutionary remaking of the social order than the American Revolution. What do we see? At the end of the day, Reconstruction is betrayed by the political parties. The capitalists sit down and they make a deal and they say, hey, we didn't win, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to start shutting down some of those offices of Reconstruction. And you can see African Americans who are elected to office in the Reconstruction period, that tide crests as the two-party system sells out the idea of a multiracial republic, right, to safeguard their own position. And that's why we have to have a third-party, independent political movement, because they're going to do that again. And they do that every day. They sell out everyday Americans, and they sell out our equality to line their own nests. And the third thing that I would say is that when we talk about Jefferson as having this idea of being a more radical founder, right? There's a great exchange of letters between Madison and Jefferson when Jefferson's in France, and Jefferson's talking to Madison about what's going on. And remember, this is when we're seeing revolutionary activity in France, and Jefferson says, look, we can't have, as Matt said, the dead ruling the living. So I'm thinking like back of the envelope calculation, right? 19 years. That's really what we can expect. Any act passed by an existing body of individuals of the age of majority should have to be active, because after that, they died very young back then, right? Don't worry, without healthcare, we're getting back to that. So maybe we respect the founders in that way, right? But what we're basically looking at here is this discussion was had, right? Jefferson's not there, right? Thomas Paine's in the same boat, right? Not in the room. And Madison basically deconstructs a more radical interpretation of what we can expect for an argument of self-government. And he turns that, again, into a much more centralized, elitist expression of what the revolution actually achieves. So I think that really what we have here, again, and, we have an opportunity, right, to create what the left means, to create what the people mean, but that's going to require, as Matt said, active engagement, right, and bravery, right, to seize on an opportunity that lots of people who've ever existed in the history of the human race haven't had. And I guess that's what I would say.
Thank you. All right, we are now going to open it up to the audience for questions. I would like to start by posing a question to each of the panelists. If you can each respond in about a minute or so. While it is certainly true that the bourgeois revolutions, whether or not we want to call America and the American Revolution technically a bourgeois revolution, but it is certainly true that they have unfulfilled promises of, in the Jeffersonian sense, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Are we to reject this bourgeois project, or are we to take it on as a socialist movement and to try to complete the bourgeois project more than the bourgeois revolutions, than the bourgeois class was capable of doing?
Want me to go first?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to say no. If we in the modern era are to consider ourselves truly revolutionary socialists, communists, however you choose to self-identify that, you can't take the like bones of the old system and try to put like new flesh on it. It will always re-engender the same forms of exploitation and hierarchy and domination. You can't just there's never going to be a way to reform the American project into a socialist society. The only way to truly break with these systems and these legacies of domination and hierarchy and exploitation is the wholesale abolition, destruction, and replacement of the current systems of governance, production, management of production. The entirety of the socio-political system must be revamped. I'm not saying necessarily cultural revolution style, but there are going to be, because I'm sorry, I'm going to run over a little bit, I think, but there are foundational notions of what liberty means baked into the American ideological framework that are inherently contradictory to collective notions of liberty that are espoused in the socialist tradition. Individual liberty espoused in the American ideological liberal tradition is inherently incompatible with a collective vision of the future. We cannot take this old broken thing and sort of just tweak it until it becomes a new thing we like. You need to throw the old thing out and get a new thing, which would necessitate an actual American revolution. However many different forms that would take, but there's an electoral aspect of it, but there's also the building of dual power elements, elements within the community, like socialist organizations, trade unions, coming together and asserting the state power for themselves. When the actual state begins to fail to help the people, as it already has, even if going back to Katrina, we see that our government does not care to actually come in and help people. We saw this really exemplified during COVID, when the government's response was nothing, do nothing, couple of checks. It will eventually become the responsibility of revolutionaries to take on that role of helping the people support themselves. So I come down hard against the idea that there's any sort of way to continue the American project into a socialist future. It will be a complete break, the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union, a totally different social order.
All right, Matt.
I've been torn between the idea of a kinder, gentler exploitation versus none. So this ownership of the means of production and the establishment of a new system of relations among humans, this stuff sounds really good, but it will be violent and total, and I you know, I want to have hope that something like that could happen, but I think we'd have to get closer to it. There's such big steps to take towards something like that right now. So I think that one of the things that I think that there was an awareness of some the founders, and this is like the greatest gift, of course, of the Constitution, that is changeable. You know, the one way that you can allow for your mistakes to be fixed is make it so that they can be. So changing the Constitution, like to incorporate an understanding of what it means to be a person and the relationships between them, and other such things, maybe scratch or just alter the Second Amendment to make it conscientious of social welfare and not just armed individuals. So I think that there is a means by which we can move towards that better, move towards I don't know, the ideal better. So if that means finishing the revolution, sure. And I think that there should be plural foundings of America. 1619, sorry, I'm bad with numbers. 1619, 1776, when the Emancipation Proclamation, Civil Rights Amendment, maybe another refounding now with this Supreme Court. Not all of them need to be had before the left. But a constant refounding of our country, not a following. So if that's completing the bourgeois revolution, yes.
Thank you. And Aaron.
Sure, I'm going to open by doing something dangerous and stupid, given that I'm sitting on a panel with a philosophy professor and a member of the Communist Party, and I'm going to butcher Marx, right? You know, humans make their own history, but we don't make it as we choose. Right, and so we have Thomas Paine in our history, and Thomas Paine's ideas were better than Jefferson's ideas, and they're better than Madison's ideas. Right, he goes to France, right, and he has a very bad experience. We know that, but his ideas exist as a subtext in our revolutionary history. Right, and we encounter reality with these structures that have been built, that have been existed, and that are recreated over and over and over again. And when we look to the past to try to find alternatives, right, which is what we tend to do, right, is what we all do. It's just the nature of the way we solve problems. What are you going to do tomorrow? Well, a good place to start is, what the hell did you do today, right? But basically, that's one of the heuristics that human decision makers use to confront an uncertain reality. And so I think that what we have to do is appreciate that the bourgeois revolution, if we want to call it that was initiated, right, whenever that was, is insufficient to meeting the needs that we have now. It does fail us in Katrina. We let 1 million of our people die as our COVID response, right? We still have cities in Flint, right, that can't drink their own water, right? We have a failing state, and I do want to agree with you 100%. Dual power is absolutely vital avenue for us to explore in the face of these state failures, right? We can't ignore state power, but we have to build alternatives. And so I think that what we have to do is very soberly analyze the failures of the American Revolution, right? Cast doubt on the infallibility of the individuals engaged, and then pick up the ideas that benefit us when it comes to the construction of the kind of society that we want to build going forward.
Thank you. And if anyone in the audience has questions, this is your time to ask.
I have a question. So I guess I'll pose this to everybody. But my understanding of the American Revolution was that it was kind of initiated by the Whigs, by the radical Whigs in America, people like Benjamin Franklin, who were responding to a conservative push by the British Parliament to consolidate power in Britain at the time and kind of reestablish bits and pieces of the monarchy. And so Benjamin Franklin, at the time, I believe, thought that the monarchy could be a way to, or British government could be a way to spread civil society globally. And ultimately, I think the founding of America was built on that assumption that the American ideals would be spread globally. And I'm wondering if this interpretation of the American Revolution, maybe as a emancipatory force of society or something spreading globally, if this is a leftist position to have, and if this ideal should be preserved.
Can we do about 1 minute for each, starting with Aaron?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great question. And when I think about the actual rationale for the revolution, I do study policy narratives as part of what I do research-wise, and so I take a look at the Declaration of Independence, right? And it's a mixed bag, right? What do they want? They want self-government, right? They were really, really mad, right, that the colonial charter for Massachusetts was thrown out, right? They were upset. They were also upset about the quartering of troops, all these types of things. But they were also really mad that the king wouldn't let them just go and dispossess native peoples of their land, right? So you got a mixed bag going on here. And so was the idea that you could use American national government as a force to project American values, whatever those might be? I think that if I look at the structure of what the actual Constitution enshrined, right, there is a massive amount of ink that got spilled in the discussion about establishing a powerful centralized military force, right, especially in response to some of the failures at Valley Forge, perhaps being the most famous for those of us who took 6th grade civics. At least that's where they gave it to us in Virginia, right? Maybe different up here. So the establishment of a coherent military power, right, to expand. Now the question that I think I'm left with there is, when we're talking about expanding these values, are we actually talking about the dispossession of the fertile North American continent by a modern American military force vis-a-vis the extension of any sort of the benefits of liberties given the past treatment of the natives by the government at the time? My response, without looking too deeply in it, would be more to the cynical as opposed to the idealistic, but I'd have to look a little bit more closely at what Franklin wrote to answer with any more specificity.
Matt?
I think, if I remember the question correctly, my first answer would be damn straight. Is it a revolutionary thing? In part, if we just bracket some of the rationale for it, whether it be better or worse morally, I think of those lines, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary to dissolve the bonds that unite me with others and to assume that separate but equal station. Because human value, self-evident truth, I can claim that for myself whenever. What's more revolutionary? So that's what I'd say, I guess.
All right, so if I'm also remembering sort of your question correctly, also, if you wouldn't mind just refreshing me on sort of...
I guess if the American Revolution was kind of based on spreading a civil society globally, then is this a leftist position to have?
No. Because I would argue that they were not spreading anything we would understand as a civil society. Civil society for them was an incredibly narrow confine of who fit into that civil society, and it was not, they were not just confused and of the times. They were very aware of the contradiction in saying all men are created equal while more than half of the signatures of that document were slave owners? they were all very much conscious and aware of the contradiction therein.
Can I just say that? But you're looking at what they, you look at what they've set up, and yeah, this is problematic. It's there's all sorts of things that we could say that are wrong with it, but the act of taking up myself as self-grounding is an act of revolution. So whatever I might make of myself might be problematic, and we can talk about that as not allowing others or something like that. But if we just pay attention to the fact that they did, I mean, to rise up and seize for yourself what has been stripped from you, what has been prohibited from you, that is revolutionary.
I would argue that nothing was stripped from them save the ability to more efficiently exploit the continent on which they were already settling.
Again, you're looking at the product.
Well, yes, because if we're looking at the implications and its legacy today, I don't care what they thought they were doing. I care what they did. I care what the outcomes of their actions created in our modern world today. What they created is a ever-persisting system of exploitation of native land, both here and abroad. As soon as we got to California, what did we do? We went to the Philippines. What did we do? We went to Hawaii. We took Alaska. We reached the end of our continent, and we couldn't expropriate any more land here. We tried. We fought the Mexicans. They kicked our ass. The American project, projected globally, is one of imperial domination, exploitation of land, expropriation of resources, and the consolidation of power into a small, clique of ruling elites. I don't see anything, leftist about that, nor do I see how their intentions, good or not, are relevant to what happened. You can what is the old thing? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. It doesn't matter how good your intentions were. You still created a system wherein, however million slaves at the time were branded as property, and that was enshrined in the law. You created a system whereby settlers can just go into native land, wage a genocidal war, not with the official army, but just as bands of settlers expropriating the land. And when the natives eventually, reprise the settlers, then the state can move in. And that was our ploy. Sorry, I'm going over, but I don't see anything wherein you can't I'm sorry, to get back to your question, I would argue that the spread of American ideology across the globe is not dissimilar to the spread of British imperial ideology. We simply just took their place. As their empire fell, we absorbed it, and now as the American empire projects its power across the world, and we start to face our own decline at home, it is just increasingly more reactionary, and the ideology we export across the world is increasingly more reactionary, as we don't actually spread ideas of freedom and democracy. Who are our closest allies? Israel, Saudi Arabia, the NATO countries. None of these people care about democracy, and I would argue that we don't either. Anything we say or do to portend to caring about democracy is kayfabe. It's just a smokescreen to delude us into continuing to comply with a system that is just killing us.
But I know we might have another question to make sure we're going to get to those, but I would just add that the founders explicitly did not want democracy, nor did they care about it, right? The democracy came from us later, right? And I think that that's the important part for me here, right? Is that What the founders did and laid down, right? Certainly, we should be critical of many parts of it, right? We can actually be laudatory of particular aspects of it as well. The past is past, and until we build a time machine, right, we inherit what is created. And so, then what do we do with the declining American empire, right? Well, I am maybe alone here, but I think that we deconstruct the American empire, right? To the extent that what we see, I think comports at least very strongly with what Venya has described, right? We have a neo-colonial ventures, we have imperial occupations, we have massive amounts of bodies, right? Which have been created and wrought underneath the auspices of American imperial power. We get rid of that, right? That has to go, bar none. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't good ideas, right? I don't like the king, right? They're coronating another one now and people pay attention. Like, blows my mind, right? But we don't have that idea. We shouldn't have that idea. And that's what I think is something that we can take from it, right? Franklin said famously, right, there was a carving on the back of the chair, right? It's like, it's a rising sun or is it a setting sun, right? And so Franklin says, we've got a republic if we can keep it, right? Now, I say we extend it. Let's actually get a democracy here and see what the people can do, right? So let's take it beyond the founders and use the machinery that they provided to do that.
Can I ask a question? So a lot of this discussion from Zach's question, I'm kind of building off of it, is about like whether the founders intended or didn't intend to build the society they built. But to my understanding, with the possibilities of socialism, is that there's a certain preconditions that need to exist. One of which is the development of productive forces. So I'd like, insofar as like things like the American Revolution, like the French Revolution, the revolutions of 1848, whether or not they realize that they're advancing these like subconscious motives of society, they're increasing the possibilities of a refounding, right, on different terms. It would be something like as silly as saying like trying to advocate for universal health care in the year 980, right, is not it would be an anachronism, right? So I'd like to just ask panelists like what how do you understand capitalism's like both the necessities it poses and also the possibilities it poses for socialism?
Yeah, if any of you want to, maybe we can start with that.
Sure, yeah, I can start. So I think that I agree with you 100%, right? Like, you have to work with the productive apparatus, right, that currently exists. And, the material conditions in a great, they strongly sort of bound a set of parameters about what we can demand. So if we look at one of the other sort of revolutions, right, we can look at the administrative revolution, the construction of an administrative state, right? When we think about capitalism, right, as it exists, capitalism, as we all in this room know, is, I think Richard Wolff describes it as like if capitalism was your roommate, you would have moved out years ago, right? It's completely and utterly unstable, right? From productive excess to a complete and utter depression, right? The destruction of productive capitals and their acquisition by other capital alliances, right? An incredibly destructive, unstable force. So what do we do when, in the Great Depression, right, society collapses, Herbert Hoover puts his hands in his pockets, and people basically starve to death, right? Well, we have to do something, and we built an administrative state, right, to harness those existing industrial forces, right, for the benefit of all, right? That is one of the reasons why, in addition to, as Venya suggests, dual power, doing it ourselves, we also have to compete for state power, right? The state can serve as a positive balancing force, right, to discipline capital as we move toward a more, shall we say, revolutionary and radical formulation of human relations, which may, in fact, not need the state. So that's what I would say, is that we have to consider capitalism and its starts and fits as producing, right, a surplus which can be utilized by an effective leftist political movement in its many manifestations, right, to build a better world for those individuals.
Maybe Matt, you'd like to say something about this question?
I think that sounds right. You know, taking with the power that's there and just expanding where it reaches.
Well, so first off, I'll offer the, I guess, like orthodox Marxist take of you need capitalist development in order to create the productive forces for the creation and implementation of socialism. However, the 20th century showed us that you don't need full capitalist development, you just need a little bit of capitalist development. For example, the capitalist development in the Russian Empire was literally decades, if not centuries, behind Western Europe. But with the control of the state apparatus and the implementation of 5-year plans, the Soviet Union was able to industrialize itself in under 50 years and catch up and even surpass many of its Western European neighbors. The same can be said if you want to look at China. China did not have an industrial revolution until during the actual Chinese Revolution. Insofar as any industrial capacity existed, it existed as a result of the colonial occupation of China that took place through the 19th century. The capture of the Chinese state by the Chinese Communist Party and the implementation of 5- and 10-year plans has allowed the Chinese state to industrialize on its own without the need, and they have a capitalist class, and they use the capitalist class of China, the national bourgeoisie, to develop the economic, productive power of China. However, you can see that their state has an incredibly tight leash on their capitalist class. In China, for example, it is not uncommon for the CEO of a company who, say, steals the pensions of their employees to be executed. I would love to see that for an American billionaire who steals from their employees, or at least thrown in jail. We don't even do that. So I would say that yes, while the orthodox position is that you need capitalist development, and it's kind of superfluous because we already have that here. You know, the question of do we need capitalist development or further capitalist development, I think, is moot, as we are the most advanced capitalist society. If anything, further entrenching capitalism will just decay into a sort of neo-feudal order where the ultra-wealthy just control large tracts of land, as they already basically do. But I would say that if you look at the sort of more, I guess not revisionist, but revised, if you will, theories that come with the implementation of Leninism and Mao's changes to Marxist thought, it is very much possible to achieve socialism with minimal capitalist development and even without a bourgeois revolution.
All right. Any other questions?
There's been talk about a socialist takeover of the state or other kind of versions of that concept where slowly socialism becomes a more informative and impactful trend within governing factions. At what point do socialists no longer have use of a capitalist state in terms of expanding their ability to implement their ideas, in terms of being able to actually affect any improvement in the quality of life for people? At what point does a socialist mission outgrow a capitalist state, and with it, the strategy of electoralism?
I'm gonna go first.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd say that it would require the dual power structure established by these working class organizations to have already in itself produced the capacity to provide for the people basic necessities, It would require total, like, working class control of certain levers of society, specifically, like, the production of power. Like, you would need, like, fully unionized power companies, or at least, like, the ability through working class organizations and organs of power to influence these necessities and essentially just wrest them from state control and say, no, we're just going to give people power. It would say, we're just going to give people internet. We're just going to give people water, you know? And like, that is a slow process, you know, of converting and getting people into these necessary levers of power and production. You know, it would have to be on farms too. It would have to, you know, it is a massive project of organizing education and radicalizing people. But I would say that it would come at a time when the state is both paralyzed by crisis and finds itself incapable of responding, say through natural disasters or economic devastation like a depression, or we do another stupid war. And it would coincide with the self-recognition and, I mean, hopefully the call of the masses to the working class organizations and revolutionary parties to seize that state power. Ideally, you never want to be leading the masses. You want them to be, you know, sort of leading the charge. But it is definitely, you know, not for some time. Insofar as where we are now in terms of, like, national organizing. Also in the state's capacity to reprise, I would say that as of right now, the U.S. state could, like, with overwhelming force, suppress any sort of domestic rebellion, because the other big aspect of that is a significant capture of the military, specifically, like, the rank and file. You're not going to have a revolution in America unless you're getting all of the rank and file soldiers on your side, or at least, you know, the majority. That's all.
Whoever else wants to deal with that question.
I mean, I guess I can address it, and it'll be a little embarrassing because I'm going to draw on Stephen King as a metaphor here, right? So if we think about, I'm a huge Stephen King fan, have been for years, right? He had his peak, right? Much as we all do, right? And then, yeah, okay. But you can think about The Stand, right? And The Stand is apocalyptic. And, you know, this was what I was reading during COVID, right? So, but The Stand is like everything collapses. Right? It's gone. And so you have pockets of these survivors which have been saved. Okay. Relatively cataclysmic. But if you think about the Dark Tower trilogy, or it's not trilogy, it's now 7 or 8 books long, 7.5, I don't know, right? But you have this kingdom, right, of Gilead, which basically begins to crumble as the Tower of Reality is attacked. And its influence wanes in different parts of the tower at different times. And you see lots of different types of societies emerge, right, from the corrosion of the power of Gilead, right? Many of these, most of these, Stephen King, all of these, right, are dystopian in a sense. And so what's the impact, what's the interface between the dual power mandate that we have to have going forward as leftists and the engagement with the state? We see the state collapsing, right? It cannot address the needs of the people, right? Look at the housing crisis, right? This is something that we have, like, you have to have a house, right? That's one of the things you need. The state has abdicated. I think in New Hampshire, what do they estimate? 20,000 units? Is it 20,000, right? That just, they need to exist yesterday, and they don't. What does the state do? Nothing, right? So the state is, as Gilead, collapsing in starts and fits, right? We've managed to maintain a massive $114 billion commitment for the spreading of weapons across the world in one country, right, the Ukraine. But what we haven't been able to do is make sure that, people in Jackson, Mississippi can drink the water, right? Or that all of the children that are in this country have access to higher education, right? We see the state collapsing in these ways. So what do? That's where we organize, right? And we begin doing these things ourselves. while simultaneously making demands on the state to do better, capturing, right, state apparatus through electoral activities, right, and then turning the profligate spending of the U.S. imperialist class toward meeting the needs not only of our own people, but the people who our country's imperial actions have historically wronged. Right? That's what we have to do. So when does that happen, to answer your question? I don't know, right? I think that what we actually have to do is be engaged in the project, right, of creating these alternative structures so that when Gilead does, in fact, collapse, that what we see arising, right, is not a nightmare society, right, but a collection of competent, connected collectivities, right, that can deliver services and organize society in a human way that the state is currently not managing to achieve.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Any other questions?
What is liberty to you?
There's a good quote. I'm probably going to butcher it. But true freedom, and not only freedom on paper, can only exist when no person goes unemployed, hungry, homeless. Only in those situations can true liberty and freedom exist, and not just like a false notion on paper that, yes, we're free. I would say American liberty is fake liberty. You have the liberty to buy here. You have the liberty to create an identity through consumption. You do not have the freedom to live here. Living is not free here. It is expensive, actually. In, for example, the Soviet Union, rent, if you paid rent at all, was about 4% of your annual salary. 4% of your annual salary. And that was enshrined in law. Like, it could not be more. It is in things of, like, liberty exists when you have a guarantee of food, shelter, water, education, healthcare. That's liberty, that's freedom. Any other estimation of liberty is in my opinion, a mystification and an abstraction from any true, like, grounded sense of liberty for an ideal, you know. Like, in America, you have the ideal of freedom. You have the freedom of speech, but your speech doesn't mean anything. You can say whatever you want. It doesn't matter.
Matt, would you like to take this one?
That's really, really a tough question, you know?
It was shorter than the others.
Yeah, right. You know, so as a finite human being, my freedom is always situational, right? So it is never right to measure it against a freedom that had no situation. So it is not that this freedom is lacking right now. It is only lacking according to some measure that's not real human freedom. So wherever I'm going to find it is going to be between what I'm doing now and the people around me, and how we constitute each other. Something like that.
Platonic ideal of liberty or freedom.
Existential.
Yeah, I know.
Aaron, would you like to take a stab?
Sure, I'll take a stab. I guess that picking up on what Matt was saying about sort of the situational nature of what liberty is, right? The right wing likes to put out all of these bizarre statements, like, of course, people in the United States aren't in poverty. Look at how many flat screen televisions they have. Well, I was a sociology undergraduate, so I studied a little bit about poverty, right? And poverty is, right, not an absolute state per se, but what can you expect in relation to those around you, right? And so we have that situation. We're going to have to decide what is liberty in this particular case. Now, that said, we have to, I think, distinguish between two different types right? And in the United States, picking up on Venya's point here about American liberty, this is what Berlin calls negative liberty, right? The liberty that the government can't tell me to not do something, right? And so this is like why you can fire AK-47s into the air, like in certain states for the celebration of 4th of July, despite the fact that maybe there's school kids down the road, right? Government can't tell me not to do it. That's a negative liberty, right? But that's an impoverished, right, form of liberty if we only consider that aspect. Because we also have positive liberty, right? It doesn't matter if what's the quote? You know, it's the nobility of the law that the rich and poor alike are prohibited from sleeping under a bridge. Well, great, fantastic. Equality under the law means that the people who can't do, who can afford not to do it, right? They don't have to break the law. Everybody else gets their stuff confiscated after they come back from their shift because the cops did a sweep. Right? So we have to basically understand that there are these two notions which are socially embedded, right? And what we really need to, I think, concentrate on to achieve a real liberty is to understand what it is for each and every member of the meaningful collectivity, right? To have access to sufficient resources to realize the potential that they have, right? Given a particular historical era. Going back to Sam's question about, you know, what about these material circumstances that capitalism provides? Our liberty is going to look way different than that back in 980, right? We need to appreciate that. And in that sense, we have actual liberty and aspirational, right? To bring another. We should aspire to a liberty that we cannot achieve. And this is, I think, maybe getting on Matt's point here about people 1,000 years should look back and be like, these barbarians, right? What were they doing? But the fact that we could aspire to a liberty, right? To reject the inequality, the unfairness, the injustice that we see and pursue, right? A better, more equitable, more just distribution of liberty and all the other goods is really what we should be focused on, I think.
All right.
Could I ask a follow-up question?
Yes.
So you had you in general, as the panelists, seem to accept kind of a different dichotomy within the question of freedom, which is individual versus collective. And I didn't hear what I think is an essential question for preserving anything from the bourgeois revolutions or of bourgeois society, which is the freedom of society. I did hear a little of it in Matt's comment about founding versus founded, right? So if freedom could be defined for, you know, the bourgeois revolutionary thinkers that Platypus reads in its first half of its syllabus, as the ability of society to kind of create possibilities for its own self-transformation, or something like that. Not as the individuals that make up society, right? You know, we have the Rousseauian idea that it's not the sum, right, of all the individuals that make it up. Yet it is, society is something sui generis for these bourgeois revolutionary thinkers. And it is conceptualized and brought kind of into at least theoretical being as a task by the revolutions, the bourgeois revolutions, and maybe first and foremost, maybe foremost, by the American Revolution, right? So that's the kind of task that I want to hear what you guys think about. Is society, as conceived by those thinkers, is it just a sham concept, you know, that it, you know, is it just what it became later after the Industrial Revolution? Or was it something that can still continue to task us today if recovered?
I'd like to ponder it a little longer.
I'm going to use the bathroom, but you three can continue.
I'll take a shot at it to give you some more time, and you know, I'll come at it from the perspective of, I'll retreat to my training, right, as a public administrator. So I may not be fairly engaging on the terms of the Platypus syllabus, but I'll give you my thoughts. If you look at the American Constitution, it's an incredibly brief document. Right? So I tell my students at the very beginning of their class that they're going to have to read the Constitution. There's a collective groan. And then I tell them, you should be happy I'm having you read the American Constitution and not the Indian Constitution, right? Because the Indian Constitution runs several hundred pages long, right? So we have two very different styles of constitutional structure, right, that the American Constitution embodies. And this is why people had such a freak out about Trump, right? Trump is, in my estimation, right, a relatively, shall we say, by the books, like, individual. What he doesn't respect are the norms of American governance, right? And those norms are really what drive it. Why did Hamilton call the people a great beast? Because he was very confident that the system that they were establishing would allow men of quality, right, to be recognized in their communities, elected, and that the Republican system of government would filter out all of these pernicious demands for equality and, you know, like enough to eat and all that kind of stuff that was really troubling to him when made by the hoi polloi, right? So I think that what we have here is a situation where society was well understood by the founders. They were society men. And that they anticipated that the system they would create would filter out any of the people who didn't meet the criteria of men of quality in a society, right? And that's how they could maintain this, what we might consider cognitive dissonance between the people and freedom on one hand and the owning of slaves and the subjugation of the majority of the population on the other. Because who was society? They were, right? Who was everyone else? Not them. You could get there into society, absolutely, right? Which was one of the good things about the revolution that they inaugurated, as opposed to having to be born into this aristocracy, right? You could achieve entry, right, through success, right? And that begins the birth of this pernicious ideology of merit, right, which we still have lingering in the American political system. But I think that that would be my answer, is that there was a society, they depended on that society, right, to staff the offices, and the expansion of that society, right, has been the historical mission and should continue to be the historical mission of the left when it encounters these existing institutions, right? Expand the entry, expand the franchise, right? Create more opportunity to engage and transform the society through these institutions, I would say.
I can ask follow-ups if you guys don't have anything, but please, if you do.
I don't really have anything to really expound upon what Aaron said on that, frankly. You?
It sounds like you're asking, do we maintain the institutions even though they're institutions of exploitation and inequality, and use them for good, or do we destroy them altogether? And I'm going to say use them for their good. To start destroying now is too far from a goal, a shared goal.
And I would argue, I guess, that we must destroy them because they are a poison pill, and trying to carry them forward would poison any further attempts at development, because we would just be falling back on old systems and ideas and notions of what it means to be free, what it means to be a member of society. We do not conceive of people as being members of society unless they can fulfill certain criteria. In American society, if you are homeless, you're not a member of society anymore. If you're a felon, you're not a member of society anymore. Maintaining any sort of structure wherein you have this stratification, and obviously no left-winger would attempt to maintain these structures of depersonalization and domination, but if you're just taking the apparatus of force implementation, which is state power. State power is the ability to inflict force for one class or another, whoever controls the state. The forms of our state, even if they were to be captured at the commanding heights by good, genuine revolutionaries, you're still using the apparatus of the National Security Agency. You're still using the apparatus of the Pentagon. You're probably there's still a lot of the same people transitioning over because they're specialized people. It'll take a lot more than just getting the right people in charge or because that in and of itself is a liberal notion of meritocracy. There are good people, bad people. Most people are just people, and it is only through like a collective, like sharing of accountability, that we could like surmount those personal failings. That even like leaders in positive revolutions that I would support, they all had personal like malignancies to themselves. Getting kind of away from the point, but no, just like I'm sorry, no.
It's fine.
I lost my train of thought.
No, that's fine.
Do you have follow-up?
I do, but I was kind of reaching for something other than your definitions of society. I was thinking more in terms of, like when Marx says the contradiction of capital, or describes the contradiction of capital as social relations versus industrial forces of production. What are these social relations that he's talking about? And in 1843, when he writes to his friend Arnold Ruge, and he says that mankind will not undertake any new tasks, but only complete the old ones. Why is he secure in saying that we don't need a new task, we don't need a new definition of freedom, and we can actually, everything is already built into the old idea, the old task of society, which has merely fallen by the wayside or not been completed?
I think I can address some of that. For Marx at least, until there's like the end of the ownership and the means of production, there's the relationships between people are going to be reduced to two: commodity or competition, right? But he talks about this idea of species being, both in the Estranged Labor and throughout the rest of his work, and this is like I call it a concrete universal, where each individual is an expression of all of humanity, such that everything that I would make would be an empowerment to all of those things that are like me. Like the person who made the chair makes possible a thing for any human to sit on. But because of ownership, there's like a human world that is not for humans. Right? Yeah, here's a chair, but not for you. Here's a chair, but not for you. So when those relationships crumble, there would be like this like mutual co-augmentation of humanity through the creative things, because the things that are just repeated would be taken care of. The food, sustaining life stuff. And then only once we are free from surviving can we be human. And then we'd be like this, I don't know, it sort of gets kind of neat sounding, but he's not real concrete about what it means. Like this actualization of this species being. The I that is we and the we that is I.
It almost veers into a spiritual conception, which Marx would probably hit back at as a devout materialist, but it is in many ways like
it's concrete spirit.
Yeah,
it's human making a world for humans.
It's the actualization of human potential as a material thing and not as an ephemeral spiritual one. So, in a lot of ways, the Christian ethos did carry on into Marxism. There is, so to speak, a kingdom of God wherein all people live as common as brothers and sisters and live together and care for one another. That is the end point of communism. And even it is just like, what is that society that we get to at the end? I think Marx gets a little wishy-washy on it because you can't know. Like, all of the things that are going to happen before we get there are going to create people fundamentally different from us in how they understand the world, how they understand each other, how they understand everything in life. And that will be brought about through the process of struggle towards this better future. But, like, for example, we cannot really put ourselves in the mind of a person who lived through, like, the Protestant Catholic Wars, the 30 Years' War. We can't actually you can read about it, you can understand it, you can't actually understand how it felt to truly believe in like this heretical antichrist in the Pope, and you have to wage an eternal war against. Like, that in the secularized world, that is just not something like you can put your head in. And so society is like this idea of like the society at the end of Marx's telos is one that we can't understand, but we can attempt to understand in those fundamental things we all share and seek. Like there, like some universal truths of unconditional love for other people. Like most people recognize that as a good thing. The idea that we should care for the other people in our community, whether or not it profits us. Like these are the ideas I think that he was working with, but once again, you can't know what those people are going to structure their society like, because they're going to live through so many different things that we can't conceive of. And that's why Marx, like, he couldn't call, like, he was pretty good and he was pretty on the ball about most things, but he didn't know everything, you know? And especially in the early 1840s, as opposed to at the end of his life, he had, like, some very drastically different opinions on how society works and what that final society looks like.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience for our panelists? All right.
Well, I have some more actually, if you don't mind going a little longer. What time are we at?
It is almost 4 o'clock.
Okay. How much longer can we use for the Q&A? Because I think we've accepted some of the... there's some things I would be hesitant to concede, and that I think Marxism wouldn't concede for communism, that we've kind of like accepted generally in this discussion. And some of them have to go back to this, again, with bourgeois society, the freedom that it kind of defined as a task, and the universality of those who could benefit from it, and the mechanisms through which it could be expanded and, you know, actually, I don't want to say perfected, but pursued. These do go through things like property, right? You know, the American Revolution is in line with the kind of Lockean conception of property as being earned through labor, or whatever the right phrase is.
Virtue.
Deserved through labor, yeah.
So that's sort of my big problem with the Lockean ideals, is that it is totally idealistic. No one is actually responsible on their own individually for their position in society. Everyone is enmeshed in a series of social relations that you can't even perceive yourself. You know, like it's kind of an extreme thing to say, but like no one has ever really had an original idea. Everyone is just working off of something they already learned, you know? Because unless you just sit alone in a cave and raise yourself, other people are going to be influencing you and bringing you to these decisions and conclusions that you make, but would not have come to without your relationships to these other people. So the like Lockean idea of the individual, like, I reject, because there is no individual subjectivity, really. We are all working off of the collective notions that we learn from each other and share and reinforce in society. So, like, the idea that anyone can truly be this, like, I guess, not Lockean, but like Randian individual is like...
Speaking of Rand, she uses Aristotle, but she like misses this key thing from Aristotle. The second line into his Politics is, he says, the individual is not self-sufficient. If you think you see a human that isn't part of a community, it's either a beast or a god. In other words, you didn't see it. So he goes on to say that the first community has a woman and a slave, so it's not a happy thing that follows. but that truth doesn't waver. That there is nothing that I have that isn't brought to me on the backs of, well, now
Everyone
countless
else.
millions. Yeah, everyone. Better to say everyone. And so to begin with an I is neither real nor ideal.
But we're not beginning with an abstract I, right? And we can even, just within the modern tradition, we can even just reach for a Hobbesian idea of some corporeal structure, right? Just to restate the Aristotle point with a modern reference, that everyone is connected, right? And to reduce, I understand your point and I appreciate it and agree with it, but I don't think that it's the main point of Locke for the bourgeois tradition.
Oh, no.
You know, based on like power structures. I think it's more important is, you know, the right of conquest, might makes right, not being the basis for property, right? Arguing against that is extremely important for everything that comes after, right? For the revolution, which I would the bourgeois revolution, I would try to defend as a real revolution, kind of on this basis. That yes, it establishes the individual, but it also establishes a new conception of society at the same time, which can only exist with one another.
I would say that it's not actually establishing a new conception of society, it's just secular Calvinism. Like, and that exists in Europe, you know? Like, it's not it isn't really a break with any previous regimes of social organization. It's just a secularization therein. You know, the separation of church and state is great. The Dutch were doing that 200 years before the British colonists. We learned that from them. Like the British colonists and the Puritans, they took the Protestant Reformation and the desacralization of community. Protestantism brought to the European religious, spiritual, socio-political sphere this idea of the individual existing as itself. Before that, that's not a thing really in European society. You're embedded in a community. You're part of this natural folk way that is wedded to the rituals of the Catholic Church and agrarian life. What does Marx call them? The sack of potatoes? The peasantry who is embedded, they do not have a conception of individualism that we could conceive of. What they conceive of as an individual and what we conceive of as an individual are wholly divorced. And so, in the founding of the United States, it's not a rejection of any previous modes of social production. It's just a further abstraction away from anything sort of community centered. It's totally redounds everything to the individual, and this does come in my reading from the influence that most of these guys were secular Protestants, whether they were Calvinists or Lutherans or Anglicans. They saw the problem of the market, or I guess the solution, the problems they saw were the problems created in early capitalism, and their solution was the market, I guess, and to further individualize everyone. You want to say?
Just real quick, I find it interesting that the preamble says "we the people," and then the first Bill of Rights is about individual rights, and it seems to be there's an attention. We ordain and establish for you and you and you and you and you. There's that. Where are we supposed to give the order of priority, in the we or in the individual? And so that's attention. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I would say sort of coming at it from not the ideal, what Locke was necessarily imagining would happen, right? But the way that the Lockean sort of formulation actually informed some government actions. The United States expansion west was genocidal, right? But they didn't tell themselves, hey, you know what we're going to do? We're going to get together and be genocidal, right? What they did is they said, look, we have all of this unimproved land, right? Relying on a Lockean conception that it was not owned because it was unimproved. And so then what we're going to do, right, is we know that there are individuals out there, right, but we're not going to recognize their claims because it doesn't slot in to our Lockean conception about how you establish ownership here. And so then we're going to use our force to push them off the land. And so I kind of feel that, if we think about what it actually meant when we have the ideal, right, which I agree in a sense with the Lockean ideal, is if I mix my labor with my capital, that's mine, right? The capitalist steals that from me, right, in a sense. But, if you don't then, right, respect the fact that people can do that in different ways, then we see political prerogatives, right, coming up against philosophical prerogatives, and I think we saw which lost, right? That the U.S. was totally willing to mobilize military power, right, to dispossess individuals of this land because they didn't happen to subscribe to a particular understanding of ownership, right, of property. And so, in that sense, does the actual behavior of the United States as an outcome of the revolution, comport to a Lockean ideal? I would say no. I don't know if that's what you're asking, but that would be my response to that, I think.
Can I make a brief point that segues into a question about Locke? So, for Locke, he's writing, as you said, to try to discover what is the origin of property, because property, or the world as a whole, seems to have been given to mankind as a whole, and yet we need to find a way to divvy it out to individuals for anything to be used. How can I eat this apple if it belongs to everybody, because then I'm making it mine? And so Locke's sort of solution to this, as you mentioned, is the idea that when you take nature and you mix it with your labor, it becomes your property. And can we not interpret this as a step beyond a progression from what came before it, which is, of course, the divine right of kings and the feudal conception that this land belongs to this person because God wants them to be in this position in society?
I do think that there's a problem with that, because Locke thinks that we start from no history. They're like, here's nothing, so it must be for me. There's no moment. There's the first moment of the application of labor to thing. So that's always already the case. So we find ourselves in the midst of it and we can't judge we can't think that the origin happened like that, as if from nowhere. It was always already within a world of ownership and property. So he's made a definition of property that fits an ideal abstract state that has never existed. And he's done so in a way that he can ground the government on. So at least the ownership by kings admits to a history.
That's why it's revolutionary too, though, right?
Well, but it also, sure, you could say somewhat revolution. I mean,
it's not revolutionary because it's abstract. It's not real.
It's an ideal. Ideals on their own are not revolutionary. You can. Marx actually put his thoughts into action. Marx and Engels were original organizers of the what was it? Before it was the Communist League, it was the Working Man's Association. The first International was founded by Marx and Engels and their generation and cohorts. They were idealists, but they also were materialists first. They looked at the material realities, not the ideals. Because ideals will always lead you astray. It's nice to have them, and it's good to use them as sort of like a guiding light. But you're dealing with the situation on the ground, and that is never going to be ideal. So you're always going to have to make some concessions to your ideals. And the notion of property enshrined as as the foundation of individual liberty is your right to take your land, as it were, is inherently flawed, because how can an individual own the land? Like, sure, you can say, like, there is no way to say you own a piece of land without it being primitive accumulation and right of conquest. Like, unless you are literally the indigenous people of that place, you were the first people there, right? There was no American founding without this sort of primitive accumulation, and they recognized that before there was any notion of America. The early Puritan settlers did think that God had given them this country and that it was their right to do with it as they pleased, and those are the ideological forebearers of the men, like literally their grandfathers in some cases, who founded this country. Like, so these notions of property and liberty are inherently tied with the ability to expropriate land from people who cannot fight back against you, whether through disease or force of arms or what have you. Not one polity on the North American continent could resist European colonists for long. And it was that inability that allowed us broadly, the European colonial apparatus, to dehumanize these people. As much as we didn't like the Turks and the Ottomans, they were still a polity that you had to recognize as at least somewhat your equal. Their rights and property rights were sacrosanct in that you had to respect them because they could make you respect them. The indigenous people of North America did not have the technological capability or the social coherence to fight back in a way that would have forced the settlers to acknowledge their personhood. And it was this early ability of the American, just like early English, Dutch, and Swedish settlers and French, who through this Protestant idea of this is God's country for us, anyone else here, they're not supposed to be here. And you can do with them as you please. And we did. But, sorry, I got kind of far. I get kind of far away from the original question, but it is this idealistic notion of property as liberty that can't exist in a way without violent accumulation. You can't go out into the woods and stake a claim and say, this is mine, without the implication of violent force to defend that or seize it. Because if you just rely on a piece of paper, someone else with a gun can just come and take it from you. Like
might makes right.
Well, that's property inherently requires might makes right. Personal individual property and the maintenance therein requires at base, regardless of whatever ideological coding and sheen you put over it, the pure imposition of force by one individual or group over another individual or group to enshrine those property rights. It is impossible to have private property and liberty if you and any notion of community, really.
What about the notion of freedom from Adam Smith, where the money in your pocket is a new form of freedom that does extend to everybody? Doesn't matter who you are.
His assumption is that I take home what I make, and that's the most bogus assumption ever. I mean, he has forgotten ownership of the means of production, right?
Well,
he assumes that the augment. He's earlier, but that's what Marx points out that Smith is
People
overlooked, right?
Well, a craftsman is not the same as a wage laborer.
Exactly.
And that I take home what I make. The augmented production, the screws, I make 20 pins a day if I make pins by myself. 8 of us make 48,000. He thinks that I take home my share of those 48,000 pins.
He has
I do
merchants
not.
of stock, right? Proprietors of stock. The investors.
He thinks that my production augments my wealth, and that is a false equation.
I thought he thought that the division of labor augments the wealth of society.
And that is a false assumption. It augments part of society. It makes them rich, actually. So, and the equation of buying with liberty is like a difference of between like doing and owning. And so like liberty would make itself into the world owning just by something. So if it's a liberty, it's not one. It's liberty at Kohl's.
The idea
I
of
shop at Kohl's. So
liberty being a thing, liberty through consumption is not liberty. You know, what are you, if you're free to buy things? Congratulations! Now you have a pre-prescribed set of things and ideas and identities that you get to pick from, rather than organically coming to who you are as an individual. You must prescribe yourself to these set brands, and like, even if you consciously try to go against that, that's a brand. Like being counterculture, that's a brand. You know, like we are in a fully marketized society. There can be no freedom in terms of just participating in the market, unless, of course, you're already a capitalist, because then you are already operating from a different, like, point of what liberty means. You know, like, I forget where this comes from, but like in America and most capitalist countries, if the punishment for breaking a law is a fine, that law only exists for the poor, right? So
I think if I can jump in here, you know, the way I like to think about this is that there is this distinction that exists between private property, which is the means of production, and then personal property, right? So in a sense, right, do we have more liberty because we can go out and buy things that express what we want to express, or we want to engage in that kind of exchange between individuals? Sure, right? That could be an expansion, especially if we're thinking about, you know, particularly culturally conservative inheritance, right? Where you can't do these types of things because there is no market, right? You're just going to stay on your parcel of land and do your potato planting, right? That's what you do. So it could be that from that perspective, there is a certain amount of freedom, right, which a monetized economy might present. I think that the crux of the matter here, though, is that the minute that you begin, as Rousseau said, to start erecting fences, right, now you're a thief, you know? And so that's what we really have to think about. And I think this gets back to the conversation between Jefferson and Madison, right? Like, where did these decisions that we made about the structures that we've established, when do those end, right? Jefferson wanted to say 19 years, right? And I think that what I want to say is they end when we decide they end, right? And the recreation of the freedom is what the freedom is, you know, in that sense. The engagement with that question of, why does Bezos get what Bezos got, right? And is that just, is that legitimate, right? Under the prevailing laws, it is. But I want to say it's still not, right? So that's the conversation I think that I want to have, is how do we engage that particular problem which is confronting us at this moment.
All right. I think if there are no more questions, then we can wrap this up. And I want to thank all three of our speakers for coming here today. And yeah.